welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling something really fundamental. How new drugs, once they get that FDA nod, actually become available to, well, us. It's definitely not automatic.
No, not at all. There's this whole intricate journey after FDA approval. It involves insurers, these groups called PBMs, figuring out if a drug gets on their list, their formulary.
Right, the formulary. And that decision really dictates whether you or I can actually get the medication prescribed by our doctor and what it might cost us.
Exactly. So to make this real, we're going to use a specific drug as our example today, Plozasiran.
Or FCS.
That's right. FCS is a really severe, rare genetic disorder. People with FCS have incredibly high triglyceride levels. We're talking levels that put them at constant risk for acute pancreatitis, which is incredibly painful and dangerous. Well,
and I gather there aren't many good treatment options currently.
Precisely. It highlights a huge unmet medical need. Managing it now often involves an extremely strict diet, which is frankly very hard to stick to.
So Plozasiran could be a big deal for these patients.
It really could be. So today, we'll explore this whole evaluation maze, the committees, the criteria they use, how it differs maybe between different insurance types, all through the lens of Plozasiran's journey.
Okay, so the FDA says yes. What happens next? Who are the immediate gatekeepers?
Well, the next stop is the payers. Think health insurance companies, government programs like Medicare and Medicaid, and importantly, those pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs.
Ah, yes, the PBMs. They seem to be everywhere in the drug cost conversation. What exactly is their role here?
They're essentially intermediaries. They manage prescription drug benefits on behalf of health plans. That means they process claims, they negotiate prices and rebates with drug manufacturers, and they often develop the formularies themselves.
So they have a lot of influence on what's covered and at what price.
A tremendous amount. But the core clinical evaluation usually happens within what's called the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, or the P&T Committee.
And in terms of practical access, we expect.
It absolutely is. They're typically made up of a diverse group, practicing doctors from different specialties, clinical pharmacists who really know medications inside and out, sometimes nurses, and increasingly folks with expertise in health economics.
So a mix of clinical and sometimes economic viewpoints.
Exactly. The goal is an objective, well-rounded assessment. Their main task is to scrutinize the clinical evidence for a new drug.
What kind of evidence are they looking at?
Everything, really. They review the same data the FDA saw results from phase 3 trials, looking hard at efficacy and safety. They also consider treatment guidelines from medical societies, comparative effectiveness research.
Comparing it to what's already out there.
Yes, that's crucial. And they look at pharmacoeconomic studies too, basically. Does the drug provide value for its cost? Based on all that, they recommend whether to add the drug to the formulary and if any restrictions, what we call utilization management, or AMM, should apply.
Utilization management, we'll need to unpack that. How often do these P&T committees meet?
Usually quarterly. The aim is generally to review a new drug within about 180 days, so 6 months or so, after FDA approval.
And how do they prepare? Just read the trial results?
Oh no, it's more structured. They often prepare detailed summaries called drug monographs. These pull together all the key evidence and directly compare the new drug to existing alternatives.
Makes sense, a standardized way to look at it.
Right. And in some bigger organizations, you might even have specialized subcommittees focusing on certain diseases like cardiology or oncology doing an initial review.
And sometimes the health plan just uses the PBM's formulary.
Sometimes they start with the PBM's master formulary, yes, and then might customize it. It varies.
Okay, so the P&T committee makes its clinical recommendation. How did that recommendation turn into the actual coverage rules a patient experiences?
That gets us into formulary design and that utilization management, or EUM we mentioned. Broadly, you see 3 types of formularies.
Okay, what are they?
First, you've got open formularies. These cover almost everything FDA approved. Lots of choice, but usually higher costs for the plan.
Right. Less common nowadays, I guess.
Generally, yes. Then there are closed formularies, much more restrictive. Only drugs on the list are covered unless you get a specific exception. This gives payers more leverage to negotiate rebates.
And the third type, the one most of us probably have.
That would be the tiered formulary. This is very common, especially in commercial plans, and Medicare Part D drugs are grouped into tiers.
Like generics on tier 1, preferred brands on tier 2.
Exactly. Tier 1 is usually low-cost generics with the lowest copay. Tier 2 might be preferred brands. Tier 3, non-preferred brands of higher copays. And then you often have specialty tiers, Tier 4, Tier 5, for really expensive drugs.
And that's where a drug like Plozasiran would likely end up.
Almost certainly. Those specialty tiers often have coinsurance, meaning the patient pays a percentage of the drug's cost, which can be substantial.
Yeah, that percentage can really add up fast. So that's the formulary structure. What about those tools you mentioned?
Right, utilization management. These are the tools payers use to manage costs and ensure drugs are used appropriately according to their criteria.
Like what?
The big one is prior authorization, or PA. Your doctor needs to get pre-approval from the insurance company before prescribing the drug.
Why would they require that?
Often for high-cost drugs, or drugs with potential for misuse, or where there are very specific clinical criteria for use. The doctor usually has to submit documentation showing why you need that specific drug.
Okay, PA. What else?
Step therapy is another common one. The plan might require you to try a cheaper preferred drug first. Only if that doesn't work can you step up to the more expensive option.
Makes sense from a cost perspective, though potentially frustrating for patients.
It can be. And then there are quantity limits, or QLs. These restrict how much of a medication you can get in a certain period, like, say, 30 pills per month.
So PA, step therapy, quantity limits, these are all ways the payer enforces their definition of appropriate use.
Precisely. And it's key to remember that their definition might be narrower than the broad FDA-approved label. It's about managing use and cost based on their assessment of the evidence and value.
And sometimes there's another committee involved. You mentioned value assessment committees.
VACs.
These aren't universal, but some larger organizations have them. They might step in, especially if the P&T committee finds multiple options clinically similar, or if a drug is just extremely expensive. VACs focus more heavily on the non-clinical business side, the net cost after rebates, the overall budget impact.
So P&T focuses mainly on clinical, VAC more on the dollars and cents.
That's a simplified way to think about it, yes. It's really this ongoing tension, this balancing act between clinical judgment and financial pressures. And how it plays out depends a lot on the payer's structure. Are they integrated, managing everything in-house, or heavily reliant on a PBM?
And the rise of these super expensive specialty drugs must be making this even more complicated.
Absolutely. It's driving the growth of specialty tiers and much more sophisticated, sometimes stringent management strategies.
So when these committees, P&T or VAC, are looking at a new drug like Plozasiran, what are the absolute core criteria they're weighing?
It really boils down to two big things: clinical evidence and economic considerations. They have to balance both, especially for a potentially high-cost drug.
Let's start with the clinical evidence. What are they looking for there?
Okay, first is efficacy. Does the drug actually work as intended in the clinical trials? They'll look closely at the phase 3 data, the primary endpoints, the main thing the trial measured, and key secondary endpoints. The quality of the evidence matters too. Randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, those carry the most weight.
Makes sense. What about the downsides?
Safety, that's paramount. They evaluate all the adverse events seen in trials, weigh the risks against the benefits. Any significant safety concerns can lead to very restrictive coverage or even non-coverage.
And it's not just efficacy and safety in a vacuum, right? It's compared to what's already available.
Exactly. That's comparative effectiveness. How does this new drug stack up against existing treatments? Is it significantly more effective, safer, easier to take? Does it fill a real unmet need? If it offers a clear advantage, that's a strong argument for coverage.
But if it's clinically similar?
Then cost becomes a much bigger driver in the decision. If there's no clear clinical edge, payers are going to be very focused on the price difference.
Okay, that brings us to the economic side. How do they evaluate the value of a drug?
This is where pharmacoeconomics comes in. A key tool is cost effectiveness analysis, or CEA.
CEA, what does that involve?
It compares the drug's cost to the health outcomes it produces. Often this gets boiled down to an ICER and incremental cost effectiveness ratio.
Which means?
It's basically the extra cost for each extra unit of health benefit gained. A common unit of health benefit is the QALY, the quality adjusted life year. It tries to capture both length and quality of life.
So cost per QLL, is there a magic number payers look for?
Not really a single magic number, but payers often have internal thresholds or ranges they consider acceptable value. Is spending X amount for one extra QALY considered reasonable? It's complex and can be controversial.
I can imagine. What other economic analyses do they do?
Budget impact analysis, or BIA. This is more about the short-term affordability. How much will covering this new drug increase the payer's total spending over the next year or few years?
So a drug could look cost-effective long-term, based on CEA, but still be hard to cover if the immediate budget hit is too big.
Precisely. A huge upfront cost can be a major barrier, even if the long-term value seems good. Payers have budgets to manage year to year.
So they're integrating the clinical benefits, the cost effectiveness, the budget impact, trying to get an overall sense of value.
That's the goal. They consider the total cost picture, not just the drug list price, but administration costs, managing side effects, potential savings from, say, fewer hospital visits.
It's definitely more than just the sticker price.
Absolutely. And these formal economic analyses, CEA and BIA, are becoming standard practice, especially for high-cost drugs. But again, there's that tension between long-term value and short-term affordability.
Are there other sort of softer factors that might play a role?
Yes, definitely. Unmet need and disease severity are big ones. A drug for a serious condition with few or no alternative, like FCS, might get more favorable consideration. Think orphan drugs. Also, its place in therapy is a first line, second line, and of course there's confidential manufacturer rebates and discounts. They significantly impact the net price the payer actually pays, which is critical.
And what about drugs approved quickly, maybe with less data?
Yeah, evidence uncertainty. If a drug gets approved via an expedited pathway, payers might be more cautious, maybe impose stricter WEM or ask for more real-world data collection post-launch.
Okay, that's a great overview of the general process. Let's bring it back to Plozasiran. What are the key details about this specific drug that payers will be zooming in on?
Right. So, Plozasiran from Arrowhead Pharmaceuticals, the FDA accepted their application, their NDA, back in January 2025. The target decision date, PDUFA date, is November 18th, 2025.
And the indication is FCS, that rare genetic disorder with sky-high triglycerides and pancreatitis risk.
Exactly, a clear unmet need. And you mentioned the FDA designations.
Breakthrough therapy, orphan drug, fast track.
Right, and orphan drug in Europe, too. These signal the seriousness and rarity, which helps speed up review, but also flags to payers. Likely high cost ahead.
Makes sense. How does it actually work, the mechanism of action?
It uses RNA interference RNA technology. It's a small interfering RNA, or siRNA, designed to specifically target the messenger RNA for a protein called APOC3 in the liver.
APOC3, what does that do?
APOC3 basically puts the brakes on triglyceride breakdown and clearance. So by targeting the APOC3 mRNA, Plozasiran reduces the amount of APOC3 protein the liver makes. Less APOC3 means the body can clear triglycerides more effectively.
Okay, so it lowers APOC3 to lower triglycerides.
Yeah.
And how is it given?
It's a subcutaneous injection under the skin, and the dosing studied in the main trial was quarterly, once every 3 months.
Quarterly dosing could be a plus for patients compared to, say, monthly or weekly shots.
Potentially, yes. Convenience and adherence are factors payers do consider, though often secondary to efficacy and safety.
So what did the big phase 3 trial, Palisade, show? Did it work?
Yes, Palisade met its primary endpoint. It showed a really significant reduction in median fasting triglycerides at month 10. We're talking around an 80% reduction for both the 25 milligram and 50 milligram quarterly doses, compared to just 17% for placebo. Highly statistically significant.
An 80% reduction is substantial.
Very substantial, and some individuals saw reductions up to 98, 99%. It also met all 4 key secondary endpoints.
What were those?
Significant reduction in APOC3 levels, as expected, but critically, a statistically significant reduction in acute pancreatitis events over 12 months.
The pancreatitis, that sounds like the really big one for FCS patients. How much of a reduction?
The data showed an 83% reduction in the odds of having an acute pancreatitis event in the Plozasiran groups compared to placebo over that year. That's a major finding. Wow.
83% fewer pancreatitis attacks. That seems clinically massive.
It really is. Preventing pancreatitis is the holy grail in FCS management because it's so dangerous and impacts quality of life so severely. This result is likely the strongest part of Plozasiran's value story.
What about safety in that trial?
In Palisade, it was reported as generally well tolerated. Overall adverse events were similar to placebo. The most common things were pretty standard: abdominal pain, COVID-19, common cold symptoms, headache, nausea. Serious adverse events were actually less common in the Plozasiran groups.
What about safety in that trial?
Yes, in trials looking at Plozasiran for other types of high triglycerides, not FCS, there were some observations of dose-dependent increases in LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, and also some worsening of glycemic control in patients with diabetes at higher doses. Payers will definitely note this broader data when assessing long-term safety, even though it wasn't seen as clearly in the FCS trial.
Got it. So strong efficacy in FCS, especially on pancreatitis, Generally good safety in that specific trial, but maybe some question marks from other studies. How does this fit into the existing treatment landscape? You said options were limited.
Extremely limited. Before any targeted drugs, the absolute cornerstone was that ultra-restrictive low-fat diet, 10-15% of calories from fat.
Which is incredibly hard to maintain.
Exactly. Leads to poor adherence, continued high triglycerides, ongoing pancreatitis risk, nutritional issues, poor quality of life. Standard drugs like statins or fibrates just don't work well for the underlying defect in FCS.
Any other options?
Some cautious use of medium-chain triglycerides, avoiding alcohol, certain meds, and in emergencies for acute pancreatitis, plasmapheresis can temporarily lower triglycerides, but it's invasive, not a long-term solution.
So a huge unmet need. But didn't you say there's now a competitor?
Some cautious use of medium-chain triglycerides, avoiding alcohol, certain meds, and in emergencies for acute pancreatitis, plasmapheresis can temporarily lower triglycerides, but it's invasive, not a long-term solution.
So Plozasiran isn't entering an empty field. It has a direct competitor right out of the gate.
Yes, that's a critical piece of the puzzle. In December 2024, Ionis Pharmaceuticals got FDA approval for Tryngolza, the brand name for olezarsen. It was the first drug specifically approved for FCS.
How does Tryngolza work? Same mechanism.
Similar target, different technology. Tryngolza is an antisense oligonucleotide, an ASO. Think of it as another type of molecular scissors targeting the APOC3 mRNA in the liver, leading to its breakdown. Same goal, reduce APOC3, lower triglycerides, but a different approach than Plozasiran's RNAi, okay?
And how is Tryngolza administered?
Also a subcutaneous injection, but it's dosed once monthly.
Monthly versus potentially quarterly for Plozasiran. Interesting difference. What did Tryngolza's trials show?
Its main phase 3 trial, called BALANCE, showed a statistically significant reduction in triglycerides versus placebo, about 42.5% adjusted reduction at 6 months, improving to 57% at 12 months. Also significant APOC3 reduction.
And the pancreatitis outcome.
Also very positive, a substantial, clinically meaningful reduction. Only one pancreatitis event in the Tryngolza group versus 11 in the placebo group over 12 months. They also reported fewer hospitalizations overall.
So, also effective, particularly on pancreatitis. What about safety for Tryngolza?
Common reactions included injection site reactions, some decrease in platelet counts, joint pain. The FDA label notes potential for low platelets, increased glucose, liver enzymes, and LBLC, recommending monitoring. Okay.
And the elephant in the room, the cost.
Right. Tryngolza launched with a wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC, of $595,000 per year.
Wow. Nearly $600,000 a year. That definitely sets a benchmark.
A very high benchmark. So Plozasiran is coming into a market with a clear need, but also a direct, very expensive competitor that also showed good results, especially on pancreatitis.
How will payers compare them? The triglyceride reduction numbers look different. 80% for Plozasiran versus maybe 57% at 12 months for Tryngolza.
Payers will absolutely scrutinize that data, yes. While direct cross-trial comparisons are tricky, they'll look at the reported magnitudes of effect for both triglyceride lowering and, perhaps more importantly, pancreatitis reduction. Plozasiran's higher reported triglyceride reduction and that 83% odds reduction in pancreatitis might be positioned as key differentiators.
And the dosing frequency difference.
The potential quarterly dosing for Plozasiran versus monthly for Tryngolza could be seen as an advantage for convenience and adherence. Payers will weigh all this efficacy, safety profiles, dosing against the eventual price.
Which for Plozasiran is expected to be very high.
That's the universal expectation, yes. Given the orphan status, the novel technology, Tryngolza's price point analyst forecasts, everything points to Plozasiran being another ultra-expensive specialty drug.
So Arrowhead has to justify that price, especially against an existing option.
Exactly. They need to demonstrate clear value, likely focusing heavily on that potentially superior pancreatitis reduction to command a price in that same ballpark, or even higher.
How will payers formally assess that value, the cost effectiveness?
They'll rely heavily on those CEAs and BIAs we discussed. Right now, we don't have public HTA reports, say from ICER, specifically on Plozasiran for FCS.
But payers will do their own or demand them from Arrowhead.
Absolutely. Given the expected cost and the competitor, internal or manufacturer-submitted economic models will be essential for access negotiations. They use standard HTA methods, comparing costs and QELYs gained versus Tryngolza or maybe even standard care, and modeling the budget impact.
That pancreatitis reduction data from Palisade, preventing costly hospitalizations for acute pancreatitis, is where Arrowhead can build a strong argument for cost offsets and overall value. translating that clinical benefit into dollars saved will be critical.
So the economic story is just as important as the clinical one here. For a drug likely priced this high, absolutely. They need both a compelling clinical narrative and a strong pharmacoeconomic justification.
Now, does this whole review process look different depending on the type of payer, commercial insurance versus Medicare versus Medicaid?
The core principles evaluating clinical evidence against cost are similar, but the specifics can differ quite a bit.
How so for commercial plans?
Commercial insurers generally have more flexibility in designing benefits, formularies, and They've become very aggressive in managing specialty drug costs, shifting drugs from medical to pharmacy benefit, using those high-cost specialty tiers, requiring extensive PAs and sometimes step therapy. Orphan drugs get covered, but usually with these tight controls.
What about Medicare Part D?
Part D is run by private plans but regulated by CMS. They also use specialty tiers where beneficiaries can face significant coinsurance, up to 33% sometimes, until they hit the catastrophic threshold, though low-income subsidy recipients have much lower costs. Plozasiran would almost certainly land on a specialty tier there, requiring PA.
And Medicaid?
Medicaid is state-run with federal oversight, so there's state-to-state variation. They get mandatory manufacturer rebates, which lowers net costs. Generally, they have to cover drugs from participating manufacturers, but use tools like preferred drug lists, PDLs, often requiring PA for non-preferred drugs, and states can negotiate supplemental rebates for better placement. High-cost drugs like Plozasiran will definitely face utilization management here, too.
So despite the differences, for an expensive drug like Plozasiran, the bottom line is likely similar controls across the board.
Pretty much. Expect placement on the highest specialty tier and mandatory PA everywhere. Interestingly, the orphan status might actually increase payer scrutiny during PA.
Why is that?
Because the budget impact per patient is so high, payers will want to be absolutely sure it's only used for the correctly diagnosed small FCS population. They'll want to see proof.
What kind of proof for the PA?
Likely documentation of severe high triglycerides despite diet, ruling out other causes, maybe even genetic confirmation of SCS. Specialist prescription probably required too.
And since it's an injection, it'll likely be handled under the pharmacy benefit.
Typically, yes. Subcutaneous injections usually fall under the pharmacy benefit, unlike PharV infusions, which are often medical benefit. Ensuring that alignment is important.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. Summarizing this deep dive on Plozasiran and the payer Gauntlet, what are the key strengths and challenges ahead for it?
Strengths are clear. Strong efficacy data on triglycerides and ApoC3, that really compelling statistically significant reduction in acute pancreatitis, the novel RNAi mechanism, potential for convenient quarterly dosing, and seemingly good safety in the main FCS trial.
Yeah, the challenges.
The biggest are the anticipated very high cost, the direct competition from Tryngolza, which also has good data and a high price, those safety signals seen in non-FCS populations, and the relatively limited long-term data available at launch.
So what factors will ultimately sway payer decisions?
It'll come down to the head-to-head comparison with Tryngolza perceived differences in efficacy and safety. The net cost after rebates will be huge. The strength of the cost-effectiveness argument, especially regarding pancreatitis prevention offsets, the overall budget impact, and ensuring accurate diagnosis to target the right patients.
Okay, the P&T committee. Who sits on these committees? Sounds like a critical job.
Strict prior authorization is a given. Criteria will focus on confirming FCS, diet failure, maybe genetic testing, specialist involvement. Highest specialty tier placement is almost certain. Step therapy with standard lipid drugs is unlikely, but payers might prefer Plozasiran or Tryngolza based purely on which gives them a better net price.
So the outlook.
Look, Plozasiran looks like a potentially transformative option, especially with that pancreatitis data. But it's entering a tough market access environment with a high-priced incumbent. Success hinges on Arrowhead proving differentiated value, hammering home the pancreatitis benefit, providing a solid economic case with cost offsets, and being competitive on net pricing. Expect tight controls via PA. Payers will also likely want to see ongoing long-term data. Negotiation dynamics will matter immensely, leading to varied access plan by plan. It really is a payer gauntlet.
It's fascinating and also a bit daunting. Thinking about these incredibly expensive but potentially life-altering drugs for rare diseases, it really forces us to confront some tough questions, doesn't it? How do we as a society balance rewarding innovation and providing access for those who desperately need these treatments against the very real pressures on healthcare budgets and overall affordability?
That's the crux of it, isn't it? There are no easy answers. This intersection of cutting-edge science, patient need, and economic reality is incredibly complex and shapes so much of modern healthcare. Understanding how these formulary decisions get made is just one piece, but a really critical one, in that larger puzzle.